Greetings and welcome to this edition of
Positronic.
I'm Barry P. Cook, and I'm here to talk about the latest episode of Star Trek Strange New Worlds. It was called Ghosts of Illyria. And as the episode opens, an away team is investigating an abandoned colony of Illyrians, a race of genetic modifiers, on a planet, the name of which I think is Hademic 9. I didn't have the subtitles on, and it sounded like that's what the name of the planet is. And it's a planet that is frequented by ion storms. And if I'm not mistaken, an ion storm is what caused the landing party to switch universes in the episode Mirror, Mirror. Anyway, as I said, the Illyrians are a race of genetic modifiers, and genetic modification is forbidden in the Federation post-eugenics wars, which makes sense. So the storm is bearing down on the planet. The away team goes to beam up, but there's a problem. So most of the away team, the landing party, is beamed up after the engineer plays around with some things to get the transporter to work, but Pike and Spock had to be left behind because they couldn't repeat the procedure successfully at that point. So number one takes command as we see the first signs of a problem when a crew member, Ensign Lance, who had been on the landing party, basically headbutts a window to get his face through it to get closer to a light source. He is stopped from hurting himself too badly by Ortegas. We then find number one in her quarters, where she seems to have a moment where she also starts to crave more light. She even rips her uniform top open to try to let more light in, but it seems to pass. She doesn't seem to be overtaken by the craving for more light. We next find out that the whole landing party is apparently having this issue where they crave light, and it's because they're all lacking in vitamin D, according to Dr. M'Benga, whose name, by the way, is M'Benga, not M'Benga, which I have thought it was for like 45 years, ever since I knew that character's name. So, okay, I always thought it was M'Benga, but it's M'Benga, which, okay, Star Trek mystery solved. And I can't read, apparently, because now that I think about it, it was obvious that it was M'Benga, just like T'Pol is T'Pol. You say the, although you don't say T'Pol, right? So why would you say M'Benga? You say T'Pol, you say M'Benga. See, I should have figured that out a long time ago. Anyway, number one starts to investigate the situation, starting with the transporters, which apparently have backups for pattern integrity, which is interesting. That comes up in the conversation because she's talking with Hemmer about, biofilters and filtering out contagions and so forth. And he says something about how since their refit, it has backups for pattern integrity, which I don't know exactly what that means because it doesn't get super specific, but like, I'm sure that somewhere down the road, the Enterprise has had transporter problems that you would think that it would have been solved by that, including the incursion into the mirror universe, including Kirk being split into two. And then, the next time the Enterprise was refit, they had problems with the transporters. So I don't know. I don't know what that's about. But anyway, number one then talks with La'an about La'an's ancestry when La'an brings up the dangers of genetic modification, which again are banned in the Federation, except apparently for disguise purposes, at which point, or in which case it's perfectly acceptable to alter somebody's genome. Like, is that not the same thing as genetic modification? Like, what? I don't know what the difference is. Of course, that would explain why that wasn't done all the way up to Next Gen, right? So why were they doing it in the last episode there? I don't know. Or the premiere, anyway. Anyway, during this conversation, the elephant in the room is acknowledged. She is indeed the descendant of Noonien Singh, which apparently caused her no end of trouble as a kid. The kids would tease her because she was related to him, call her augment, things like that as a pejorative So that whole thing comes up, which is interesting. The next thing that happens, though, is that the vitamin D deficiency starts spreading somehow from crew member to crew member, making people who weren't on the landing party suffer a massive drop in vitamin D. So, not knowing how to contain it immediately, number one institutes a ship-wide lockdown. Back on the planet, Spock is reading the colony's logs, and it seems that the Illyrians were trying to reverse their modifications so they could join the Federation. And after he tells Pike this, they both see what looked like a few large energy beings flying towards the building they're in as they're looking out the window. So what the heck is that? Anyway, back on the ship, we find Uhura in her quarters, which apparently she shares with other crew members, which is interesting because in the lower ranks, you would assume that that's what happens, but they never depicted that on any of the other shows because it never really came up. So it was interesting to see that because that, mirrors real life, of course. But she's there in her quarters. She wakes up from behind like an enclosed sleep pod thing. And she finds her roommates basically burning themselves like badly, with a simulated sun right in the middle of the quarters. And it was kind of bizarre because they're all like red and sunburned and stuff. She tells the computer to end the simulation, which of course means it was a hologram, which, why? Because the Enterprise doesn't have holograms, because the technology didn't exist, and because the captain said he wanted it all taken out. So I don't know how that happened. But anyway, she says the phrase y'all in the scene, which people wouldn't still be saying that, I don't think. But who knows? It certainly was never said in Star Trek before. Not to mention the fact that she's not from the American South, where you would find that phrase being said. She's African. So, what the hell was that? Anyway, it turns out that the condition is spreading by means of light, which is pretty wild when you think about it. Like, imagine a disease that spread through the light. Ooh, that would be crazy. Because of this, the sick crew members are sedated and the ship is shut down, except for life support, just about, to try to prevent the disease from spreading anymore. Number one continues to investigate and is alerted to a situation in the transporter room where she finds the engineer, Hemmer, trying to beam up a portion of the planet's molten core so that he can go into it for the light. And she has to stun him to keep him from running into it. And then she manages to deadlift him off of the floor by herself and carry him over her shoulder. And I'm going, what? Back on the planet, Pike and Spock come into contact with the energy beings, who then surround them and seem to protect them from the ion storm when it breaks through the window. We then learn that the energy beings are in fact the missing colonists, who were converted into those beings as a result of a disease that they contracted when they tried to reverse their genetic modification and were then hit with an ion storm while infected, which is crazy. Number one arrives in sickbay carrying the engineer over her shoulder, and Nurse Chapel or whoever was there is like, how are you doing that? And it turns out that she's freaking Illyrian and genetically modified, or as she says, bioengineered. And it's like, what? Anyway, the doctor then succumbs to the virus and a warp core breach begins as La'an tries to flood the room or the ship with radiation, which number one confronts her over, obviously, because what she did is she brought down the containment field over the warp core, which is going to lead to a breach. So in order to stop her, there's some hand-to-hand combat, which was pretty cool. And even though number one is able to subdue La'an, they both end up getting blasted with radiation. But it turns out that this is what cured the illness in La'an, because her proximity to number one, created chimeric antibodies in her. And I'm not sure what the science is there, but that's what Nurse Chapel says. From this, they're able to divine a cure for the crew. Number one then turns herself in for hiding her origins, resigning her commission. And Pike declines to accept her resignation, saying that he now knows the Illyrians are misunderstood. And of course, he was able to make it back to the ship because the storm passed and they were able to beam him up. Now, it turns out that the doctor caused this whole issue by not allowing the emergency medical transporter, which of course doesn't exist, to be upgraded when the ship was in space dock because it would disrupt the pattern buffer in which he is storing his very ill daughter's pattern, which, as we know, you can do for very long periods of time. He's doing this so that a cure can be found and she can be materialized and cured so that she won't die as a child. And instead of taking disciplinary action, number one says she'll see to it that the medical transporter gets a dedicated power source so that it won't interfere with the main transporter in the future. But I don't see how that would make a difference. I wasn't sure how the power source, the power was an issue, how it failed to filter out whatever. I didn't see the connection, but anyway, there you go. Number one then records a log entry explaining how she found support with the captain as opposed to him turning her in or whatever. But she wonders if he only supported her because, she had saved lives and had performed heroically, and if he would have not supported her otherwise. And she wonders out loud, when will it be enough to just be Illyrian? But as I suspected she would, she then deleted the log. Before the episode ends, we get a really cute scene of the doctor and his daughter when he materializes her in sickbay and spends some time with her reading her a story. So I thought this was, again, a really good episode. I didn't see any glaring problems with the writing. It didn't hit us over the head with any kind of message, though it did bring up the issue of, how people with differences are treated and, which brings up the whole subject of prejudice. And I think it's interesting ground because, the eugenics wars is a thing in Star Trek history, and it was bad. They were bad. And, obviously the whole Khan thing didn't work out well. So it makes sense that genetic modification was banned and that people who are genetically modified are sort of looked at with a jaundiced eye. So, but on the other hand, you can't paint everybody in every, that has a particular characteristic with a broad brush. Disabled people, old people, LGBT people, short people, overweight people. You can't paint, everybody with a broad brush just because they have a characteristic. So, and I think that's a very Star Trek message. So I really liked this episode. It was good. Episodic is the way to go, man. It's the way to go. I don't know why they don't realize that and change things around with Discovery. It could improve the show a great deal. One thing I didn't understand is why, while all of this was going on, they didn't just dose everybody with vitamin D. Like, obviously, that wouldn't be a permanent thing. You'd have to cure the underlying problem. But, while all these people were freaking out and stuff, and the thing was spreading, why didn't they just inoculate everyone, quote unquote, inoculate everyone, or fortify everyone with some vitamin D so that they wouldn't experience, the craving for the light? I mean, at one point, the doctor goes down and it's just inject him with vitamin D so we can keep going and then figure it out. And, I don't know why they didn't do that or why they didn't mention why they couldn't do that. It seemed like a no-brainer to me. The show continues to be gorgeous. I mean, it's just gorgeous. There's just no two ways about it. So I'm loving this show. 3 episodes in, 3 good episodes. The acting is great. I think Ethan Peck is becoming more and more Spock-like. I think Rebecca Romaine is fantastic. Of course, Anson Mount is fantastic. I like their version of Nurse Chapel, even though it's not really Nurse Chapel. It's a cool character. It's not really Nurse Chapel. Anyway, small nitpicks aside, once again, this show is knocking it out of the park, and I can't wait for the next episode. I, of course, will be back with a review of said episode once it's released. Until then, I take my leave and, as always, wish you peace and long life.